Welcome, everyone. We have some people entering the waiting room for this Zoom, but uh, this is Bob Bowen. I'm the president of the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame, and I'm speaking to you from Davis, California, here at the museum. And I have Major Taylor over the shoulder watching the proceedings. And today we are talking with John Howard about his book, The Black Cyclone, the hero the world forgot. And I'd like to remind everybody that this is a biographical novel as opposed to the traditional biographies that have been published previously. And we're so honored to have John Kennedy Howard joining us today from the northern part of San Diego County. And for those of you who don't know, and very few don't, but John Kennedy Howard was inducted into the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame in 1989. And he, as a cyclist, represented the United States on 3 Olympic teams. He won 19 national championships. And he's been an Ironman world champion. He does it all, and now he is an author. And this book that has come out about Major Taylor is a phenomenal story, including a lot of primary source material that he got directly from Major Taylor's daughter, Sydney. Which he started interviewing her in the mid 1980s out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we are going to get started here, and we're going to turn it over to John. And we've got a lot of things to go over in the next hour, and lots of stories to tell and images to share. So please welcome John Howard. How are you doing, John?
Excellent, Bob. Thank you. It's a real privilege to be one of the caretakers of Major Taylor's legacy, and I'm proud to be able to introduce the new book, The Black Cyclone.
All right. Well, we're going to kick it off, and I've got some young Marshall Major Taylor images here. So take it from here.
I'm trying to eliminate this Zoom being recorded sign,
Yeah,
so
just
I
say
can see the
okay. Yeah,
slide, and
yeah.
I may
Just
have to get some assistance. Oh, here we go. Okay.
yeah, just click OK, and
There we
we got it
go. Got it.
recorded.
Yes. Okay.
You'd
So
like to
what we're seeing here in this first slide is uh, the wonderful artist Mona Mills. I collect her work. Has done this painting of a very youthful Major Taylor. He was one of the very first sponsored cyclists. Ivor Johnson Arms and Cycles backed Major Taylor. And I think it's important to point out that he was born in 1878, a few months after my grandfather, Kennedy. And I will always remember that because of the fact that he was born in close proximity to my grandfather. Major Taylor was a black prodigy in a white man's sport. And I say that knowing that this era, there were no black athletes, and very few of the white establishment or athletic white athletes could understand nature's gift of speed to this young man. He was clearly the fastest rider of the era. He actually did a kilometer, and those of you who are cyclists will certainly appreciate this, in 57 seconds on period equipment. So I think it's safe to say that he was the quickest in his day. He learned to ride as a trick rider. He was taught, we believe, by Bertie Munger, his coach, and he performed for his first employer, Sam Hay, at the Willitson Hay Bike Shop on Bicycle Row in Indianapolis. Let's go ahead and fire up the next slide. Again, very youthful Major Taylor. He became a child prodigy from the very early days. He was backed and sponsored, first of all, by the Southern family, a wealthy railroad family in Indianapolis. They were very prominent, and their son, Daniel, was about the same age as Marshall. He was called Marshall in the early days. He didn't acquire that name Major until much later, probably another 2 years later. And when he would perform his tricks in front of the bike shop, his main objective was just to show off his skills. He was proud of what he could accomplish on his bicycle, his trick bike. And I think it's, I don't know how many people know the Major Taylor story, but the first race of his career was on the 4th of July. Sam Hay told him with 5 minutes left to go before the race started, it was a handicap, that it was part of his job responsibility to enter this race. And he didn't have to go far because Major Taylor complained vehemently about actually having to race with real bike racers. But he looked around at this motley assemblage of riders who were about his age, and he realized that he probably was in better shape than most of them. And sure enough, there was a crash in the first corner, and he danced out of there as fast as he could go on that small gear, and subsequently won the race. And the athlete that beat him, or I'm sorry, that he beat in this race was the Indiana state champion, Walter Marmon, who would go on to greater fame as one of the builders of the Marmon Wasp, which was the first Indianapolis 500 racer. And the Marmon automobiles prospered from that point on. Let's go to the next one. The actual roots of the association of Major Taylor and Bertie Munger go way back. In this slide, which was donated by Buck Peacock, we see Major Taylor in a wagon, and I suppose the meaning of this little display is lost to antiquity, but we do see a couple of prominent racers at the time. This photo was taken in Clarksville, Missouri, at the top of the mountain, the lookout point. There's Percy Stone, Tillman Whitaker, who was one of the top high wheel racers at the time, and on the right-hand side we see Bertie Munger. So what this represents is anybody's guess, but this was sort of the close of popular high wheel racing and the dawn of what I guess we could call the safety era. So onward with the next slide. Yeah, I think it's important to point out that there were women in this sport even then. This is Tilly Anderson. Tilly and Major Taylor met in Indianapolis. Tilly's sponsor was Thistle. Thistle was a popular brand of bicycles, and they sponsored Tilly Anderson. She came to Indianapolis and actually beat Major Taylor in one of those classic city limits sign sprints. And after she did that, she explained to him how she did it. And it was simply a matter of learning how to throw the bike at the finish line, which she did extremely well. And Tilly also had something else to add to that. She said, Major Taylor, you're fast, but you need to grow eyes in the back of your head. And I took that in a very broad sense, because that's sort of the way his career evolved. Um, I think it's important to point out that the old boys club banned women from racing bicycles. And they did that because one of Tilly's cohorts and fellow racers, Dottie Farnsworth, who was a real showboater, was doing what was called at the time, more popular with motorcycles, but also bicycles engaged in this. It was called the Wall of Death, and they would ride straight up a vertical wall and try to lap that thing as fast as they possibly could. Well, Dottie didn't make it. She fell off the wall and was killed. So that was the reason. It had nothing whatsoever to do with bicycle racing, but as I said, the old boys club, the LAW, powers that be, decided that it was just too dangerous for the dainty of the sexes. So women were, until the 1920s, banned from racing bicycles. Let's take the next slide. Yeah, this is one of the, I believe, the Parisian slides. The photos were taken by one of the first sports journalists who specialized in photography, Jules Bew. And all of the really good representations of Major Taylor were done by Jules. He was a huge man. He wore a frock coat, probably 240 pounds, because that's what it took to move cameras in those days. These were heavy tripod affairs that were anything but light. And that's probably where all of the photographs of Major Taylor came from. Could we back up a couple of slides? There's a couple more. I don't know if you can do that or not. Yeah, one more. Yeah, there is a tendency to look at Major Taylor's career as all good or all bad, good and evil. There really weren't as many, how should I say it, good guys and bad guys as you might think in his career. There were socially conditioned people who acted with prejudice in times, and sometimes extreme prejudice. And I want to tell you about a couple of those episodes. One, he was traveling to Savannah, Georgia, which is one of the spots that you would want to go. They had a wonderful track there. Cycling was extremely popular in Georgia at the time, especially Atlanta. But Savannah had its own bicycle track. So a lot of the East Coast riders traveled to Savannah for training during the cold weather in places like Chicago or New Jersey and such. And when he got there, he had an occasion very early on, I think it was like a second day, to go out for a ride. And he did. And in the process of doing that ride, he met a triplet, three riders who were motoring up, but they caught him and they wouldn't speak to him. And of course, that being Sons of the Confederacy, that may be what was done at the time, but it was the social conditioning that I mentioned earlier. And I think Major Taylor took offense at that. And so what he did in return was simply sprint up the road ahead of the triplet. And of course, they should have been able to catch him, but they couldn't. He was that strong, that fast. and he actually maneuvered through traffic back into town, and they couldn't catch him. But by the time he reached his rooming house, a few hours later, a rock with what was known as a white cap letter attached to it came sailing through the front window of the rooming house. And basically, what it said was, with a crudely drawn skull and crossbones, Major Taylor, you have made a nuisance of yourself. If you are not out of Savannah by sundown, you will pay. Well, his sponsors had him out on the next steamer. They weren't going to wait around for the what might have happened. And as a result of that, he had to go back to Chicago, not Chicago, but in this case, Worcester. He was already in Worcester at that time. And I think the conditioning that Major Taylor did was usually on rollers. And he performed actually in a vaudeville act with Charlie Murphy, Mile a Minute Murphy. And they performed all over the East Coast. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but a few months later, something else happened at a dirt track in Taunton, New Jersey. Major Taylor was crowding another rider whose name was Becker. And, you got to remember, these guys were racing for a paycheck, a big one. And they were the best paid athletes of any sport at the time. And Becker, in response for that, because he didn't qualify for the finals and Taylor did. So as they were cooling off, Becker came up behind him, and he outweighed Taylor by about 40 pounds. And he grabbed him by the neck and he wrenched him off of his bike. The bike went sailing into the infield. And if it hadn't been for the constable with a billy club, Major Taylor might not have been alive after that, because Becker throttled him into unconsciousness. And that was a very, very close call. Major Taylor was unable to ride the final, and it took him, you can imagine how harrowing that must have been for him, but it took him quite some time to recover and get back on the track later, and it certainly wasn't that outing. So there were a couple of near, I could say, near-death experiences that he went through in the process of being who he was. I think we could probably run down back about 3 more slides, Kate, if you want to move. Give me
And as I'm doing that, John, can you just mention the size of the crowds at some of these bike races? Thank
They
you.
were huge, always sold out. In the day, you went to the baseball game when all the seats at the bike track were sold out. That's a fact. Cyclists were the best paid athletes. They were certainly the daredevils of the era. When Major Taylor competed, it was oftentimes an event that drew, as I said, maximum crowd. But one side of the track may have cheered him, and the other side would boo him. He had fruit thrown at him. It was a strange mix of anticipation and loathing. I don't know how else to put it. But I think that some of his. Go ahead. Sorry, Bob. Did you have a comment? Okay. All right, I think some of his problems were brought on by himself and Bertie Munger. For example, the race that took place in the capital city track, where you had Walt Sanger, who was a professional rider. In the book, I call him a pompous peacock of a man because he wore this singlets very tight, showing off his large biceps. And he just was ready to retire. And what he was ready to retire with was a world record for the mile. And he set that record with a pace team. And pacing was easier for riders because they all they had to do is glue themselves to the back of that tandem, or in some cases triplets. But not long after the record was set, like 2 minutes, the announcer made the announcement that Major Taylor was going to attempt to break that record. And Munger had set up the two double tandems and was convinced that Taylor could break that record. And Sanger went as fast as he could, but Taylor actually did break the record. But in doing that, he did not exactly ingratiate himself in the eyes of the League of American Wheelmen officials, and they shut their watches down. They weren't even going to time Taylor for his obtrusive second race. So that was one of the things that stirred the ire of a lot of the wheelmen. And not long after that, a race promoter named George Catterson, who decided he was going to have a race he was a developer. And this race was going to be to his development. It was 75 miles north of Indianapolis. And the riders would start again on Bicycle Row, down where all the shops were. And they would leave Indianapolis and head out into the outskirts. Well, because of the incident that had taken place at the capital city track, and they wanted Taylor in this race, but nobody wanted the responsibility of guaranteeing his safety. He had some issues there and was very concerned about the route. So Bertie was in that race, watching over him, as were a couple of other riders. Walt Sanger made the comment that, well, George is offering a fine new lot, which would have been a very valuable thing to win, for first place and jack shit for everything else. Nobody could participate in that race and win a prize because it all went to the winner of it. So based on that, Taylor knew that he had to get out early, and he went through the pack. A lot of the wheelmen were unhappy that he was there, but he rode through the pack with a great block by Bertie Munger and got clear of the pack, had the endurance to finish, according to his autobiography, nearly an hour ahead of second place. So it rained. It was a dismal day. Most of the field dropped out. But after that, Major Taylor was banned from ever competing in Indianapolis or Indiana again. At which point, he and Bertie Munger decided that since the season was winding down, but it was time to reconsider Indianapolis as their base. And the bicycle factory that Munger owned in Indianapolis could be easily transported to what they wanted, and that was Worcester, Massachusetts. There was also a machine shop in Connecticut. When they did build bicycles, they wanted to build the best bicycles. And later, the bike that Munger had built for Taylor would be used as a model for the Model 90 Ivor Johnson machine, which Taylor used for most of his career.
John, real quickly, we've lost your video. We can still hear you okay. So I don't know if you can, you have a button to say,
I'm sure I
there,
can
no,
probably get it back. I don't know why
yeah,
it went
get
away.
your,
There, how's
there
that?
you go. You're back. You're back. Okay. We're on the robe slide. And the size, you know, and he was making more money than any other professional athlete in the U.S.
That is true. He at a time when Ty Cobb pulled in roughly $12,000, which was a lot of money in that era. In fact, $10,000 in 1896, I believe, was $377,000 in today's money. So you can get an idea of how much money they made. But Cobb pulled in 12,000. Taylor pulled in close to 20, maybe more with appearance fees and prize money. So yeah, that's he raced in Europe, but it was a difficult connection to make. Robert Coquille wanted to bring Taylor to Europe. He and Victor Briere wanted him there, and they were the promoters for all, basically set up deals with all of the European countries. And the first offer for Major Taylor was $15,000 on the table, but he promptly refused that offer because it included racing on Sundays, which he promised his mother on her deathbed that he would never do. He wanted to honor the fourth commandment of the King James Bible, and he did so at his great expense, I might add. But when Taylor finally accepted the offer, it was for a lot less money, but it included Saturday racing. And I think this is extremely significant because the entire structure of bicycle racing had to change overnight to accommodate Major Taylor. That's how badly they wanted to see Negro Volant race against the top riders in Europe. So the next thing that happened here is that he, of course, had to get there, and he got there. It was I don't know what a voyage took in the day, but I'm betting it was at least 10 days, possibly 2 weeks to get to Europe, and even longer to get to Australia, which was another of the places Major raced. And when he arrived, he had what he referred to as sea legs. He didn't do well on that first voyage. Threw up a lot. Managed to get to Europe, and when he finally got there, it took him probably at least 10 days to get his legs back. And what we're seeing here is the famous African robe. Why would no rider had ever worn a robe like that before, but boxers wore them, so why not bicycle racing? Major Taylor had some interesting wardrobe. He wore a beanie a lot, and that, I think, very avant-garde. And by today's standard, he was a little bit ahead of the pack, and he dressed always absolutely to the nines. Nobody could touch his suits. He was just impeccably dressed wherever he went. He always presented the most impressive appearance of any of the other cyclists. Why don't we move on? Okay, the next race series, I'm going to show you a couple of slides here, represent some things that happened. And finally, he beat well, I won't say he beat him, but he raced against probably the best rider in Europe, Edmond Jacquelin, who was the French and world champion at the time. And he beat Taylor in 2 straight matches. And that was probably due to the fact that Taylor was riding in a very cold climate. Central Europe is like that. And this suited Jacquelin just fine. But what happened after the race was unpredictable. But what took place was Jacquelin thumbed his nose at Major Taylor, and he did it not once, but 3 or 4 times to make sure the crowd saw it. It was a very big deal and a huge insult to Major Taylor. And the what you'll read about that, of course, in the book. But the French press, one of the reasons Taylor left America was because of the overt racism that he encountered in America. What he encountered in Europe was very different. It was sort of a playful change of venue. He had this photo shows him with elongated features, lips and head and so forth, and that was their way of doctoring photos. They would do this a lot, and it was just also quite insulting. And Josh, who was working with Major Taylor and tells the story from the perspective of a journalist, and is one of our strong characters in this book, went to the Grand Air, the newspaper, and complained about it, but they weren't about to do anything different or change anything. Let's have the next slide. So Major Taylor recovered from that incident, and the way his mind worked, he would take things that were insulting to him. He would process them. He would go back to his hotel. He would read his catechism and his Bible, and he would seek the power of the Almighty to do what was necessary to win the next race. And in this slide, without looking up, this is called the mystery handshake. He reached over and shook the hand of Edmond Jacquelin, who, after being beaten in the first match by Taylor signaled that there would be no need for a second match, or a third match, the tiebreaker. So in this third match, and I think we can go to the next slide, he's pulling away from Jacquelin at that point. He handed the French and world champion the most profound loss of his career. He beat him by about 3 lengths. So that's how Taylor worked. That's how his way his mind functioned, was to look at everything either in terms of a joy or a displeasure. And if it was displeasure, he would process this and take it to the next level. And I think that's that level of concentration and of focus is one of the characteristics that I find most appealing about Taylor. And I always tried to do the same thing. Major Taylor was my hero. I think we all have to have cycling. In my case, growing up in the Midwest, it was baseball and all the ball sports, but Major Taylor was my hero. So let's take the next slide here. Oh, I love this slide. This is, I believe, either the Buffalo Speedway or Buffalo Velodrome, which was named after Buffalo Bill Cody, who was a performer in with the Wild West show. And I would have to believe that he performed there at the Velodrome. A lot of things happened at the Velodrome, but this photo is of Sydney Taylor. She's about 4 or 5 years old, and she was my source of information. I think I may be one of the very few people alive that has at least 3 hours of interviews with Sydney Taylor Brown, who lived to be 102 years old, I believe. We lost her, I think, in 2008, but Sydney gave me, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. What happened to Taylor after his career ended was, you'll have to read about it in the book, but clearly there were things that went well, but there were things that did not go well. Why don't we show the next slide here? He loved automobiles. This is his French Renault. Notice the chain drive that powered this beast. Later, that would be replaced, and I'll bring that up later, what replaced it. But he took this car back to the U.S., sold it, I think, in New York, and replaced it with a slightly more upgraded or updated Stutz Bearcat, which was the American icon automobile of the era. So Sydney remembers that car very well. It was yellow, and the Stutz Bearcat was painted yellow. So when she described it, I knew immediately, being an automotive enthusiast myself, what it was. So what Taylor tried to do, and I'd say unsuccessfully, was create an awareness of what African Americans stood for. And he tried really hard to get through to Henry Ford on an invention that he had, but didn't get there. Why don't we go to the next slide? Now, here's Woody Headspath. I didn't promise this to be in a chronological order. Woody is holding a much younger Major Taylor at this point. You can see the track in the background there. Woody Headspath, please read Peter Nye's wonderful article on Woody Headspath in Velo. Woody was also from Indianapolis, and he was from a well-to-do family, I understand. And Peter will tell you the rest of the story, but he often was there at the same time Taylor was there. And Au Grand Air called it the Black Invasion at one point because they were both racing. I know Woody held an hour record. What was it? An hour record? I think it was the mile record at some point. Peter will give you more information about that. But they were very good friends, and they would start each other in various races. Why don't we go to the next one? Okay, I mentioned the chain drive on that Renault. What replaced that was essentially what you're looking at here, and that's the spiral bevel gear, which was, I don't believe invented by Harry Sager, but Sager owned the rights to it. I'm not sure who actually had it, but this drive system was unique. and Taylor thought it was good for pacing. He loved it for pacing. You see the bike he's on there. It's not a great photo, but what you'll see there is a bike of this era, long, very long wheelbase. Taylor liked the outrigger stem that he and Bertie had collaborated on, which was an adjustable stem. It allowed him to slide his torso forward on the bike to gain what he thought was an advantage. I believe it was. He always showed himself with bent elbows, which is a nice flat back, which is probably his version of how do you get aerodynamic without aero bars. He would crank his saddle all the way forwards to assist him in these explosive efforts, like that 57-second kilometer, I'm sure. Yeah, he liked the forward position. He liked the bars that were kind of splayed at the bottom. Every bike he rode had that type of handlebar. He didn't always have the outrigger stem on the bikes, but he had a host of sponsors. Everywhere he went, he would pick up sponsors. In Europe, it was Peugeot and Alcyon. Alcyon was known for its scantily clad women riding bicycles on the posters. Very much an attention getter. If you've ever seen any of those Alcyon posters, they're worth a lot of money and highly collectible in today's market. So again, the spiral bevel gear became the differential. Henry Ford used that, scaled it up, put it on the Model A, and it became the standard for automobiles after that. It with of course changed considerably, but nevertheless, it was a self-lubricating system that was way ahead of its time. Early in his career, Taylor was offered a $10,000 prize if he could break the world record for 1 mile. And on a very chilly night in Philly, he almost did it, but his pacing team did their best, but they came up a little bit short, and so Harry Sager went back with his suitcase full of cash, but I think he ended up giving them a little bit of money for attempting it. There were a lot of attempts like that to break records. Speed was the name of the game, and going as fast as possible behind the motors. First, it was I call them in the book, I call them the angels of pace. The riders were set up with, usually the tandems, triplets, quads, even quints. But with the invention, of course, of the internal combustion motor, that all ended, and these bikes suddenly started appearing with motors. So the tandems were driven by the captain, of course, and the stoker would operate the motor. So a lot of these motors were brought over from France. The French owned the automobile market in the beginning. This was the Didion-Béton motor, and people like Albert Champion, again, Peter Nye has written extensively about Albert Champion in his book. Champion would bring these motors over in crates, and they would find their way onto tandems and eventually onto single bikes. And the bikes that held them were the sturdy Tribunes and Orient bikes that were a little tougher, and they'd hang that motor in the rear triangle, and that's basically the way it worked in the early days. They were smoking fire-breathing monsters that were just, I mean, they were nothing but trouble. And sure enough, that they would outpace the tracks. In the day, these tracks were rather small, and on more than one occasion, spectators, pacers, and riders ended up as fatalities. So, very dangerous proposition. Why was cycling so popular? People wanted to see that. So, for all the wrong reasons, cycling was popular at that period of time. And it would change with time as the became the motos became motorcycles, and the bicycles went back to being used for competition that was more mano a mano evolved. Let's okay, got that one. Major Taylor was a fanatic about his fitness. As his I would say he was an absolute Adonis in his prime. One of the things that Sydney told me was when she was in her physical education class at, I believe it, I'm not sure whether it was Fisk University or one of the schools that she did attend and did graduate from. There was a cardboard cutout that she identified as her father because of his body, and it was considered to be the perfect male physique, and of course that made her proud, and she promptly told people that was her father. She was very proud of her father. Estranged at the end, but nevertheless, she was extremely proud of him. Let's go to the next slide. Taylor could quite possibly have been a boxing champion. Athletes of this era were extremely versatile. He's doing battle here at the Parc du Princes with, we believe this is Hardy Downing, who was from Northern California. Taylor knew how to box. That is for sure. And there's an incident that occurred late in his career that brought that out in San Francisco, which you'll have to read the book to hear about. But as he was taking advice and giving advice to Jack Johnson, who would become the heavyweight champion of the world, they were friends. They knew each other. And Taylor told him a few things about racing bicycles. And Jack, who grew up in Galveston, Texas, began entering races. And one of the races he entered was a circuit race in Galveston. He washed out in a turn, came down very hard on his knee, and was hospitalized for several days. And when they said, "Well, Jack, are you going to continue with this bicycle racing thing?" And he said, "No, I think I'm going to try something a little safer. Now it's going to be boxing." So when Sydney was telling me that about her father and Jack Johnson, one of the stories, which again you'll read about, is how her bedroom was just below the drawing room on the house in Columbus Park. I think it was Hobson Way. Yeah, 4 Hobson Way in Columbus Park in Worcester. The bedroom where she was sleeping was quiet until they started tapping their pool cues. They played pool in the room just above her bedroom. And she said till the day I die, I'll never forget those pool cues snapping against that hardwood floor. So I took that to mean that cycling is a more dangerous sport than boxing. It certainly was one of the sports that took up a real following after cycling had lost some of its luster. But one of the promoters of the racing down in Australia had brought Taylor down there. Maybe somebody could give me his name. I'll think of it as soon as I start telling the story. But he wanted Taylor badly, and he finally got him down there. And why don't we switch to the next slide? Yeah. 10 years after that first painting by Mona Mills, you see how Major Taylor had filled out. He was a much bigger man, around 175, 80 pounds now at 5'7". But every race took its toll. I would say that his biggest accomplishment was just finishing some of these events where he was boxed in. The races, oftentimes he had to get through those bars of I think it's possible that when you look at Major Taylor, what he had to go through to win races, to get to the front, oftentimes just getting through that box that he was in, which was usually at the bottom of the track near the apron, to get to the top of the track, he had to chase down pacers who were actually pacing the leaders. And he didn't win them all, but to his credit, he won a lot of the races. And I think he had to have been operating under a real handicap. But back to Australia. I am thinking very hard. I'm going to have to pull up my copy of the book to remember this gentleman's name, but he was the promoter in Australia, and Huge Deal McIntosh was his name, and every deal he put together was indeed huge. He also brought Jack Johnson down to Australia for his fight with the Great White Hope. Boxing is not my specialty, but in the early period of time when bicycle racing was extremely popular at the cricket grounds, Taylor was his star right up until the point where Floyd McFarland and Ivor Johnson and some of his fellow riders came down to make his life absolutely miserable, just as it had been in the racing back in the States. Taylor took most of the events. He won almost everything he entered back in Australia, and most of the races were handicaps, which he had to get through from the scratch group to win. So what we're seeing here, let's go to that last slide. I believe it is. I think it's the last one. Yeah. What happened in Australia was that Ivor Lawson in this case, who was his arch rival, probably the best hatchet man in the business, threw him a hook high on the track and knocked out most of the spokes in Major Taylor's front wheel. 5-6 years earlier, that would never have happened. He, remember, was a trick rider. He was extremely adept at getting out of tight spots. He knew how to do it, but things had changed. And from this trip to Australia, he came back to the States, had a what he described as a near nervous breakdown, and wanted out of cycling. He was done. And there was one big problem with that, however. At a race, at the 6-day race in Madison Square Gardens, he had signed a contract with Coauthor to come back to Europe, and Coauthor was not going to let him off the hook. So several years went by. In fact, he had considered himself over and done with racing at that point, but the Frenchman would not let him back, and told him that he had to come back to race. He wasn't winning anymore, and he had to race on Sundays. So what happened was his spirits were drained. He didn't have the incentive that he had had in the early days, and consequently his last season in Europe was absolutely abysmal. And when we start looking at what took place on these tracks, you can see he appears to be a bit heavy on this one. It took him much longer period of time to get in shape, but get in shape he did. And that last season, because he had to race on the Sabbath, I'm not sure how many races he won, but it was far fewer than the first seasons in Europe. But I want to tell you a brief story about the race against Victor Dupree, because Dupree was just like Jacqueline, he was about 10 years younger than the Mage, and he was the French and world champion. He had just won the world championships in Copenhagen. Taylor hadn't even made the quarterfinals. So he was eliminated. And this cocky young Frenchman went on to win the world championship. But as a favor to his sponsor, Alcyon Cycles, he was asked by the Frenchman to compete in the town of Rouen, which was a very popular cycling town. And would he compete against the world champion, Victor Dupree? And he said, I will do it only if it's not on Sunday. So they set the match for Saturday. Taylor was there at the train station. Alcyon, scantily clad women, posters all over the train station. His trainer, Bert Hazard, ripped one of them down because he wanted that for his shop. And you got to remember, posters of this era were much, much bigger than they were today. But when Taylor was warming up on the velodrome for his match with Victor Dupree on the Saturday, he had a much different look on his face, and he was convinced that he could beat this young man. And Dupree couldn't take him seriously. The first match ended with Taylor winning by a couple of inches over Dupree. Took it to the second race, and he couldn't believe the old man had beaten him. He was shocked. He was convinced that his sprinting ability was the best in the world. So they lined up a second time, and Dupree pulled it out by about the width of a Alcyon bicycle tire tread. It was so close. And in the third match, Taylor pulled out all the stops. All of the tricks that he knew, had learned, all of the subtle nuances of gaining power, of gaining speed, everything he could rely on, he used. And he won the third match by a sizable margin. So it wasn't about the competition. It was more about proving a point, and he did that rather convincingly. And I think I found in a book of French photography. I will think of the name of that book shortly, but the French had a way of making Major Taylor feel wanted, especially after that photo that appeared in the Au Grand Air. And what I found was a mannequin dressed in to the nines, and it was a mannequin of Major Taylor. That was about 25 years after that last match in Rouen, and the clothing store was in Rouen. So I know it had to have been the person that they revered the most at that point. Yes, here we go. The Black Cyclone is available, and we'd love for you to read more about someone that I revere, and I think you will too. How are we
John, just
doing, Bob?
fabulous. We're right at an hour and 2 minutes. I want to make a couple notes. Peter Nye, the historian, has been following along and adding some historical background to the chat, so that's been great. We did have a question about this effort to tell the story of Major Taylor in mainstream media. I know there's a documentary coming out soon on PBS, and other efforts to help tell the story to the greater population in the U.S. Any ideas about that?
Well, first and foremost, Todd Gould will do an excellent job of telling Major's story. I'm in this one, so as a historical content provider, yeah, it's going. Major Taylor, the voice of Major Taylor is going to be Bradford Marsalis, who I think will do an excellent job of using Major's voice. The narrator is, hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Marguerite Coleman, who is a mezzo-soprano opera star and faculty member at Indiana State, I believe. And so, yes, I have not seen the documentary. I think a few people have. I think Lynn Tolman has seen it, but I have not. But I know Todd Gould is an excellent filmmaker, and it will be something you don't want to miss. It will be also streaming after the show is over.
We will post the information about how to stream it from the not only the Indiana television station, but also through PBS app. So that information will be appearing soon at USBHOF, US Bicycling Hall of Fame.org. And also, we will post the link of this recording by next week. So people who weren't able to join us live, and we have some phenomenal folks in the participation list today, including Lynn Toldman and Peter Nye and other Hall of Famers. So we appreciate everybody who tuned in today. Fascinating stories, and all of you who know John, he has phenomenal detail in his head. And read the book, and you can reach out to us. And if you have any other follow-up questions of John. And we do appreciate your ongoing support of the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame. It's really been an honor to spend this hour with you, John, and everybody else as we continue to celebrate the history of American cycling. So any final words, John, for the crew
Yes,
here?
I want to also.
Just before you do your final words, just from the chat, because
You are next.
it's my job to monitor the chat. But
Yeah.
but Lynn reports that the documentary will be premiering on Monday, at least on WTIU. And also Donald Druitt mentioned that Congress is considering awarding Major Taylor the Congressional Gold Medal. So a congressional medal. So that's really great. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just say on the Congressional Gold Medal, reach out to your congressman because we need huge support. At this point, I think we have about 54 signups, and we need a lot more than that in order to make that happen. So reach out to your respective congressman on that one. And I also want to tell you that this book would not have been possible without the contribution of Renee Maurer, my co-author. As you probably gathered from my rambling discussion here, which was actually done without notes, and I think it's important to point out that a lot of the organization of this book came about because of Renee, who is far better organized than I am. And while she is not getting as much credit as I am, I do want to point out that she is a wonderful co-author and a great human being with just as much kindness as you would ever imagine. So I have the utmost respect for my co-author, Renee Maurer.
Well, I know this has been for many, many decades a passion work for you, and we appreciate you sharing your experiences. And Kate, if we'll bring up the final slide. Um, and we had quite a good crew tuning in today, but we will continue providing information at our website at the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame here in Davis, California. And those of you tuning in from all across the country who know John and his background and continue the discussion, and it's been a real honor to hear your stories, John, and we really appreciate your efforts in documenting this and in terms of the greater story of American social history and all of your contributions as well. So it's been an honor, and we look forward to on down the line doing this again for another Tireside chat.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kate.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.